This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today I'm bringing you my Archetype guide for the Brothers' War. Over the last week or so, I've reviewed every single card in the set, and today I'm going to talk about the synergies that exist between each of the format's color pairs. In this video, I won't be talking about the cards that are just the best ones in this format, like bombs and super efficient removal. I talked about all the cards in my set review if you want to know more about their individual ratings. I'll only be talking about cards that are super powerful like that if they have some special synergy within a particular color pair. This is a more typical set in terms of how the color pairs work than we saw in a set like Dominaria United. The set does not have a ton of fixing, and you're pretty much going to be limited to 2-color decks that occasionally splash a third color. So let's dive in by talking about our first color pair, which is blue-green. To start with each of these archetypes, I'm going to talk about the Signpost Uncommon. This is an uncommon card that is in a particular color pair that is meant to show you what you want to be doing if you're in those colors. These are the only cards that are multicolored that aren't rare or mythic, further showing you that this set is all about 2 colors as your archetype. So blue-green, as you can see here from Battery Bearer, it's a ramp deck. It has a little bit of a different spin on it than usual though, because it's about ramping into artifacts. Battery Bearer makes all your creatures capable of tapping for colorless, but they can only spend that mana to cast a non-artifact spell, much like Power Stones in the set. And when you cast a big artifact spell, you get to draw a card. So how do you ramp in this color pair? Well, let's look how you do that at lower rarities. There's, of course, Battery Bearer. You also have Power Stones. Something like Koilos Rock, when you have Battery Bearer in play, is kind of nuts, because the rock can be tapped for mana, and then the Power Stone it makes can be too. And as we'll see, there's plenty of big artifacts for you to ramp into. There's also Splitting the Power Stone. I actually think this is a pretty bad card for limited, but if there is a deck for it, it'll be this one. Stern Lesson looks pretty sweet here because it makes you a Power Stone token in addition to digging you deeper in your deck. Argothian Opportunist seems like one of the best commons for this deck, sort of alongside Koilos Rock. Both of them kind of give you a Power Stone for free. Both of them are a little overcosted for what they do, but not by that much, and then you get that mana back in the form of a Power Stone. Sentinel Stalwart. This doesn't involve a Power Stone exactly, but you can tap it and a Power Stone to produce 1 mana of any color. Now, the awkward thing for this particular deck is that you probably want to use that Power Stone to ramp into an artifact anyway, so I'm not sure how well this actually works. But if you're ramping into some other stuff, or if you want to tap one of your creatures, it does give you even more mana. Philagi Excavation. This is going to be a key uncommon for this deck because it gives you a massive 3 Power Stone tokens and also gains you 3 life. This can really allow you to just slam one of the big artifact monsters in the set on the next turn, and that is pretty awesome. There's also Cradle Clear Cutter, and we'll see that these prototypes fit really well in this deck in general because all of them have like a really high mana cost to cast them not as prototypes. And then you get a big monster, and in this case you have a card that also helps you ramp. There's also Tower Worker, which can tap for colorless mana. There's also a couple of the Retro Frame artifacts. You'll have one of these in every pack. There's a couple of uncommons from the Retro Frame artifacts that work great here. Burnished Heart gives you a way to search up 2 basic lands, which is some big ramp. And Foundry Inspector decreases the cost of your artifacts. All right, so we've covered how you ramp. The answer is largely with Power Stones, but there's some other ways to do it too. What kind of stuff do you want to ramp into? Well, like I said, there's these big monsters with prototype, something like Depth Charge Colossus. I do think this one's kind of at the bottom of the totem pole because neither mode is amazing, but this is the deck it's going to work the best in because you can also untap it relatively easily if you have some Power Stones lying around, but 6 mana 6/6 or 9 mana 9/9 with a downside, not exactly where you want to be. You're more interested in something like Hulking Metamorph, which is a clone that you can play as a massive 9 mana 7/7 or as a 4 mana 3/3. Spotter Thopter gives you an 8 mana 4/5 that scries 4 when you ramp into it, and you can play it earlier if you need to. You've also got activated abilities. Third Path Savant here is sort of a stand-in for a lot of creatures with activated abilities. It has a powerful one, and how good its ability will be will really depend on how much you can really gain with all these Power Stones, because it's a mediocre card in most sets. But if you find yourself using this ability once in most games with this deck, it's not going to be mediocre. Boulder Branch Golem is sort of one of the premier ramp payoffs in the deck, I think. mostly because it gains you life, and that's often, if you're playing this deck, you're going to be playing a lot of undersized, mediocre things early, and then try to pull ahead by slamming something late. And Boulder Branch Golem does that for you. It's a 7-mana 6/5 that gains you 6 life, which will really allow you to stabilize, and you can play it earlier if you have to. You've got Mask of the Jade Crafter. You can sink a bunch of mana into this to make a big golem token. It can also unearth and do it again. It does seem a little clunkier than just having something straightforward like Boulder Branch Golem, but it certainly has potential here. Rust Goliath, another sort of premier card along with Boulder Branch Golem for this deck because it is a 10 mana 10/10 with reach and trample, and you can get to 10 mana here, but of course it has prototype and you can play it earlier when you need to. Suchi Caveguard does not have prototype like these other ramp payoffs, but it is better than all of them. As an 8 mana 8/8 with Vigilance and Ward 4, it has, its big form is better than the big form of these other cards. Even gives you mana when it dies, which you might be able to use on something like Third Path Savant. Steel Exemplar, this is really the best deck for it because it wants you to spend mana of only one color to cast it so that you get a 5 mana 6/6 with Trample. And if you're using Power Stones, it becomes easier to make that happen. There's also a couple of cards that animate Power Stones that will be at their best here. Alloy Animus can turn one into a 4/4 until end of turn, and Might Stone's animation can turn one into a 4/4 permanently while also drawing you a card. So what rares fit in here? Well, you've got Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia. She can tap for 2 mana in any combination of colors, which is some big ramp. And she likes it when you cast big creature spells, which this deck is going to be doing. You've got Cityscape Leveler. We talked about how at common and uncommon, there's some pretty sweet things to ramp into. Well, this is a rare that is incredibly sweet to ramp into. Comes into play, destroys an opposing permanent. They get a Power Stone out of it, but you have an 8 mana 8/8 Trampler that destroys a permanent when it enters play and when it attacks, and then it also has Unearth. Actually, it's when you cast, I should say, because when you unearth it, you only get to destroy one thing when you attack with it. It doesn't destroy one when it enters the battlefield. You've also got Portal to Phyrexia, which I think is surprisingly castable in this deck and is one of the biggest bombs in the entire format because it makes your opponent lose 3 creatures and then you reanimate something every single upkeep. You've got the Might Stone and Weak Stone. I mean, this is going to be a good card anywhere, but you can make better use of this mana than any other deck can. There's also an interesting rare in the Mystical Archive in the form, well, not Mystical Archive, the Artifact Mystical Archive, basically, the Retro Frame Artifacts in the form of Staff of Domination, which asks for a ton of mana, but it does a whole bunch of stuff, and if you have like 10 mana lying around, you can get some pretty real value out of it every turn. I'm not as convinced about it as I am about some other stuff, but if there's a deck it works in, it's this one. Let's move now to Green-White, another artifact-focused deck, but this one's interested on making artifacts enter the battlefield, and as many of them enter the battlefield as possible so you can trigger things like the Signpost uncommon, Yodian Dissident, which gets a +1/+1 counter on a target creature when you have an artifact enter the battlefield under your control. This includes Power Stones. It isn't when you cast artifacts. And it doesn't say non-token, so it counts Power Stones, and most of the creature tokens in the format are actually artifacts too, importantly. So you can trigger this pretty effectively, and Green-White is populated by some other commons and uncommons that want you to be doing this. So you've got the Dissident, of course. You've also got Phalanx Vanguard, which has solid stats and vigilance, and gets +1/+0 when an artifact enters the battlefield under your control. You've got Thopter Architect, which gives flying to a creature when you have an artifact enter the battlefield under your control. You've got Sarenth Steel Seeker, which either draws you a card or lets you surveil 1 every time an artifact enters the battlefield under your control. And you have Perimeter Patrol, 3 mana 3/3 that has the same trigger as Phalanx Vanguard. I think the 3 uncommons are all really strong here, and the 2 commons are good enough that this deck definitely can do some sweet stuff, especially if you have ways to trigger the Enter the Battlefield abilities as much as possible, and they're around. One of the ways you can do it, for example, is with Great Desert Prospector, which creates a tapped Power Stone token for each other creature you control. So, if you can trigger multiple times when you play this, it's going to be pretty insane. Yodian Frontliner comes with Unearth, and it's an artifact, and Unearth artifacts are extra good here because bringing them back will trigger your stuff. And this is what that does. Scrapwork Cohort puts 2 artifacts into play when it enters the battlefield, and then can do it again from Unearth. Mass Production puts 4 artifacts into play. You, of course, have Argothian Opportunist, which puts a single, Power Stone into play. You've got Reconstructed Thopter, which can trigger these things twice thanks to Unearth. Stone Retrieval Unit brings 2 artifacts into play too. Rares that fit in well here include Soul Partition, which is kind of nice here because you can use it to have an artifact interplay again. Liberator Urza's Battle Thopter gives your artifacts flash. You can get triggers at instant speed, and Teething Wormlet has one of these artifact triggers, gaining you 1 life every time an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, and it gets a +1/+1 counter the first time each turn an artifact enters the battlefield under your control. Let's move now to Black-Red, another artifact deck, but this one is interested in utilizing Power Stones by sacrificing them less than using Power Stones to cast stuff. And Junkyard Genius shows us that it makes a Power Stone when it enters, and you can sack a creature or artifact, and until end of turn, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain Menace and Haste. This is really powerful. It makes your board way harder to deal with. It's also really sweet that you can basically pay 3 to cast this. If you have 2 mana left over, you can pay 2 and sack a Power Stone effectively. You tap the Power Stone for mana, but sacrifice it, and then this has Haste and Menace in addition to everything else. So that's kind of a cool additional upside. So sacrificing and payoffs, you've got Junkyard Genius around who wants you to sacrifice things. Gixian Infiltrator likes it when you sack permanents, it gets a counter. Killzone Acrobat gives you a free way to sacrifice things, which matters. It does have to attack, and then you sacrifice something if you want to, and it gains flying. Power Stone Fracture wants you to sacrifice an artifact or creature to destroy a creature or planeswalker. Thraxodemon can sacrifice creatures or artifacts to draw cards. Transmigrant Altar is interesting because it only sacrifices creatures, so it's going to be a little less into Power Stones, but it does have a couple of reasonably powerful options. Goblin Blast Runner gets +2/+0 and Menace when you sacrifice a permanent. Pendragon Strongbow, this is going to be maybe the key common for the deck because it can just gobble up Power Stones. It can only sacrifice artifacts, keep in mind. And when it does, it gets bigger, it damages the opponent. It is just such a pain to deal with when your opponent attacks with it. Slagstone Refinery isn't a card I'm convinced will really work out, but if it works out anywhere, it will be here because you can sacrifice, a non-token artifact, get a Power Stone, and then potentially sacrifice that Power Stone for more value. There's a lot of good sacrifice fodder in the set, too. In addition to Power Stones, you have things like Gnawing Vermin, which gives -1/-1 to something when it dies. Gurgling Anointer, it lets you reanimate something directly to the battlefield when it dies. It does have to be the right size. Clay Revenant, this is a deck for it. If there's a deck for it, it seems a little clunky to me, but sacrificing it and then getting it back and stuff is pretty sweet. Anything that has Unearth is potentially interesting sacrifice fodder. It does need cheap Unearth, like Ashnod's Harvester, because then you can potentially unearth it, bring it back, attack with it, and sacrifice it if that's what you want to do. Conscripted Infantry is nice fodder because it has 2 bodies. There's one in play, you sack it, and then it makes another one. And Sibling Rivalry, this is the deck for it. You have a couple of really cheap sacrifice payoffs. Killsuit Cultist is probably the one that's the most attractive. Steal your opponent's creature, attack with Killsuit Cultist, and sack their creature is a pretty powerful turn. The Power Stone token is nice too. Ecor Wellspring is a card from the Retro Frame Artifacts. That's great here because you can sacrifice it for value to draw a card. Rares that fit well here, well, you've got Mishra, Tamer of Makfawa, which gives all of your artifacts a pretty cheap unearth cost, making them easier to sacrifice. Also adds ward to all your permanents, which is cool. Ashnod Flesh Mechanist can sacrifice creatures to make Power Stones, and you can also exile a creature from your graveyard to make a tapped 3/3. There are a couple of interesting cards in the Retro Frame Artifacts that could work out here. One of them is Altar of Dementia. This is just such a build-around. It may not work, but it is a free sacrifice outlet, and if you can leverage those, it gets pretty interesting. Same can be said of Ashnod's Altar. And Scrap Trawler, I think, has a more approachable payoff than Altar of Dementia or Ashnod's Altar does, in that when you have an artifact go to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to return one to your hand that has lesser mana value that's in your graveyard. So, sacking Power Stones is often the best thing to do, right? But if you have Scrap Trawler in play, you can start sacrificing just about anything and finding ways to get cards back from your graveyard. Sword of the Meek's interesting too. So, you're not going to do the Thopter Sword combo in this format, of course, but you do have ways of making 1/1s, including creature tokens, especially in red. And if you can sacrifice the sword for value and then get it back attached to a 1/1 for free, you're already getting pretty good value, and you could also potentially find ways to sack it for value over and over again. It's going to be a much slower version of Thopter Sword that's not nearly as consistent, but I think there's some real value to be had there. Now let's move to a deck that's not about artifacts really, and that's blue-white, which is the Soldier deck. Your Signpost Uncommon really drives this one home. Other soldiers you control get +1/+1, has reasonably efficient stats. There are a lot of soldiers in the set. There are some other soldier payoffs too with the lower rarities. You've got your Tactician, you've got Aeronaut Cavalry, which puts a +1/+1 counter on a soldier when it enters. You've got Air Marshal, which can give soldiers flying. You've got Zephyr Sentinel, which lets you return up to one other target creature you control to its owner's hand when it enters. And if it was a soldier, the Sentinel gets a counter. And you've also got Veteran's Power Blade, which I do think is the weakest of all of these, but it does equip more cheaply to soldiers. I'm not going to go through every soldier in the set. Suffice it to say, there's a lot of them. Most of the set's creature tokens are soldiers too, so you're going to be able to make these payoffs work. Rares that work in the deck, well, you've got Siege Veteran, which is just a powerful card anyway, but it does come with a soldier payoff attached. When a non-token soldier you control dies, you get a token soldier. That's sort of secondary to its much more powerful effect, but hey, it's a soldier payoff. You've got Myrael, Shield of Argive, who makes soldier tokens when she attacks equal to the number of soldiers you control. You've got Platoon Dispenser, which spits out soldier tokens, likes it when you're going wide with tokens, and has Unearth. You've got Sky Strike Officer, which makes a 1/1 colorless soldier every time it attacks, and you can tap 3 soldiers to draw cards. You even got a land. You've got Fortified Beachhead, which enters untapped if you reveal a soldier from your hand or have one in play, and it can buff all your soldiers for 5 mana. And you've got Urza, Prince of Krug. He doesn't say soldier anywhere on him, but, well, actually he does, because the token he makes is a soldier. But the main reason I have him here is because all the tokens that you want to make in this deck are soldiers, and he makes them all into 3/3s, and he creates soldier copies of things. In the Retro Frame artifact world, you have Adaptive Automaton, which is an artifact creature that is a lord for whatever you want it to be. Obviously, you're naming soldiers in this deck. Let's move now to blue-red, where we have a fairly typical archetype. It is about spells, but it's actually about non-creature spells, not just instants and sorceries. This means artifacts and enchantments trigger stuff too, which is important because there's lots of artifacts in this set. Your Signpost is very strong, turns out a 1/1 soldier artifact creature token anytime you cast a non-creature spell. So the spell payoffs include that Iconoclast, but also Wing Commando, who comes with Prowess. There's also Philology Archaeologist, who, if you have a high enough density of non-creature spells, is likely to effectively draw you a card when you play it. You've got Dwarven Forge Channeler, which comes with Prowess, as well as Monastery Mentor, which comes with Prowess. And you've also got Levitating Statue. I'm the least convinced about this one of all the others, just because it takes work. You know, you have to pump mana into this thing to ever make it a creature. And yeah, it can be big, but it seems like it's a little too clunky. But if there's a deck for it, it's obviously this one. Rares at work here, you've got Arcane Proxy, which is an artifact creature that can copy things from your graveyard, instants, and sorceries particularly. It's a little awkward that it checks instants and sorceries when nothing else in the set does, but you're still likely to have a higher density of those than usual. Hercule Master Wizard likes it when you cast non-creature spells and gives you a chance to draw non-creature spells with the same type as cards you cast during your turn. And Runechanter's Pike is from the Retro Frame artifacts, and it is a payoff for instants and sorceries, makes your creature bigger that you equip it to. Let's move now to blue-black, where we're talking about a card draw deck, and in particular, a deck that's about drawing 2 or more cards in a turn. Evangel of Synthesis is a good example of this. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then discard. This will trigger that sort of effect, and it comes with a payoff since it gets +1/+0 and Menace when you draw 2 or more cards. These are your lower rarity payoffs. You, of course, have the Evangel, but you've also got Latinam Adept. It gets a +1/+1 counter when you draw your second card. Thopter Mechanic does the same thing. Gurgling Anointer does the same thing. Interestingly, all 3 of those gain counters. The Mechanic has an additional ability where it leaves a Thopter in play when it dies, and the Anointer reanimates things, absurdly enough, with power less than or equal to its power, so the more counters you get on it, the better. Trench Stalker is not gaining a counter. Instead, it gains Death Touch and Lifelink when you draw a second card. There are a lot of ways to draw 2 cards in this set, and some of them are particularly good here. Like Stern Lesson is particularly good because you can cast it during your opponent's turn to get one of those triggers because it will draw you 2 full cards. You can also cast it on your turn to get the trigger, but I like the idea of doing it on your opponent's turn. We've seen Thraxodemon before. It draws you an extra card if you're willing to give up a creature or artifact. Scrapwork Rager. It's going to be good in a whole lot of black decks, but in this one, it's nice because it can help you trigger draw 2 effects twice, thanks to Unearth. Curate, nice instant that can draw you a card. Urza Power Stone Prodigy gives you a repeatable way to draw extra cards. Combat Courier gives you 2 shots at activating those sorts of triggers because of Unearth. Gruesome Realization is a modal card draw spell. Moment of Defiance, a combat trick that draws you a card. You've got Flow of Knowledge. You know, if you're a heavy blue version of this deck, then Flow of Knowledge fits pretty well because it's another one that can trigger draw 2 effects on your opponent's turn. Might Stone's Animation. I mean, I think it's a little bit better in like blue-green, where you're more likely to have a ton of Power Stones, but you're going to have them here too, and you're going to have other artifacts, and it draws you a card. Energy Refractor is an artifact that replaces itself. So it triggers the effect that check for 2 cards. Supply Drop can be sacrificed to draw cards. From the Retro Frame artifacts, we've got Jaloom Tome, which is a repeatable way to loot. Take Flight is a powerful aura that allows you to draw a card when that creature attacks. Rares that fit in well here, well, you've got Sky Strike Officer. You know, if you're not in blue-white, it's a little harder to get it to draw you cards. But between itself and the 1 soldier it makes by attacking, you're usually not that far away from 3 untapped soldiers. Urza's Command is good everywhere, but it does come with a card draw effect, so I included it here. Gixian Puppeteer has one of these draw your second card triggers. It drains your opponent 2 life when you do it. Transmigrant's Crown will make it even more of a pain for your opponent when they have to kill a creature that it's equipped to, because not only do you draw a card, you're probably also getting some sort of trigger. Key to the City is a nice card that makes creatures unblockable, but it can also draw you extra cards. Psychosis Crawler makes your opponent lose 1 life every time you draw a card, and you're going to be drawing extra cards in this deck. And Teferi Temporal Pilgrim is insane in every blue deck in the format, but it's even more insane here because you have all of these incentives to draw extra cards, and both his non-loyalty ability, that he gets a loyalty counter every time you draw a card, and his -2 ability wants you to be drawing extra cards. Let's move now to black-green, where you have a graveyard deck, and in particular, it's a graveyard deck that wants creatures in the graveyard. Not just anything, it wants creatures, so you need a high creature density for this deck to be at its best. Skyfisher Spider is your signpost uncommon. When it enters, you can sack a creature, and when you do, you destroy a non-land permanent. And then its death trigger checks for creature cards in the graveyard, and you gain 1 life for each one, and exile Skyfisher Spider if you want to. That second part is actually more representative of what this color pair wants to do, though obviously the first ability helps you load your graveyard by sacrificing something. Graveyard payoffs, you've got Skyfisher Spider. You've also got Battlefield Butcher, which costs 1 less to activate for each creature card in your graveyard. You've got Emergency Weld, which lets you return an artifact or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. You've got Gurgling Anointer again, because it does reanimate stuff. No One Left Behind, another black reanimation spell. Overwhelming Remorse, which costs less for each creature or planeswalker. Thran Vigil is interesting. It seems like sort of an awkward card to me because this deck wants you to have as many creatures in your graveyard as possible, and this wants you to have things leave your graveyard, but if there's any deck for it, this is probably the one that makes the most sense. I mean, you could put it in a deck with a bunch of Unearth, which is also good in this deck because, you know, you can get value out of your graveyard, but it does seem awkwardly positioned given what you normally want to do in this color pair. Clay Revenant, you know, you can get it back. Scrapwork Rager, sort of a stand-in here for Unearth stuff. Gaia's Courser is another real payoff where it checks for 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard when it attacks, and if you have them, you draw. Gnarl Root Pallbearer makes creatures bigger the more creature cards in your graveyard, and Skull Flayer gets a +1/+1 counter during your upkeep if you have 3 or more creatures in your graveyard. There's also a lot of really nice ways at lower rarities for you to load your graveyard. You've got Disciples of Gix, which lets you search only for artifacts and put them into your graveyard and then shuffle. But everything in this format that has Unearth is an artifact, and there are several other artifacts you want in your graveyard. So you'll be able to load your graveyard potentially with 3 creatures right away for some other effects. Gnawing Vermin mills you 2 cards when it enters. Ravenous Gigamole mills you 3 cards when it enters and can return a creature that it mills. Blanchwood Prowler mills 3 cards and lets you get back a creature if you milled one. Wasteful Harvest I don't think is nearly as good as the Giggle Mole or the Prowler, who actually add to the board, but it does mill 5 cards and let you return a permanent if you milled one. Burrowing Razor Maw doesn't let you return anything, but it's a reasonably efficient creature that can trade up for something and then also mill you for value. There are some rares, of course, that fit in with this deck, like Deathbloom Ritualist, which adds X mana of any one color, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Ashnod likes to exile creatures from your graveyard, so she's another card that could be a little bit awkward here because of the fact that if you have a lot of cards that want you to have 3 or more creatures in your graveyard, she will turn that off. But if you have a well-stocked enough graveyard, she can definitely turn those creatures into value. Hostile Negotiations is a pretty powerful draw spell, and no matter what happens, you put 3 cards into your graveyard in addition to drawing 3 cards, and that's a pretty strong effect for this deck. Razorlash Transmigrant can come back from the graveyard. Fauna Shaman is interesting because you can discard creature cards to search up other creature cards, so you can discard things with Unearth, which go well in this deck, or, discard anything just to get 3 creature cards in your graveyard and search up something else. Gixian Puppeteer, we talked about it in the Draw 2 deck, but it also works here because when it dies, it can reanimate a small creature from the graveyard. Let's move now to Black-White. It's also a sort of graveyard-oriented deck. Hero of the Dunes here sort of shows you what this deck is about. It's about creatures and artifacts that have a mana value of 3 or less. This, of course, includes creature tokens. So this deck is going to like tokens. So, it pumps smaller creatures and it can reanimate one. It gives you some really impressive value. The graveyard theme isn't quite as pronounced. It's more of a sub-theme, and the central part of this deck is really kind of a low-curve aggro deck that has some late-game grindy plays with its cheap creatures with cards like Hero of the Dunes. So other payoffs at lower rarities that care about mana value 3 or less, well, there's Airlift Chaplain, which mills 3 cards and can return a creature with mana value 3 or less. There's Recruitment Officer, which is a nice aggressive creature who has a ability that will allow you to look at the top 4 and put a creature with mana value 3 or less into your hand. Recommission, which can reanimate things with a lower mana value. And No One Left Behind, which is a flexible removal spell that can reanimate cheap things really efficiently, and it can reanimate big things reasonably efficiently. Rares that care about these mana value things are Tocasia's Welcome, which checks for creatures with mana value 3 or less entering the battlefield. It only triggers once a turn, but it lets you draw a card when you do it. Kayla's Reconstruction is probably going to be harder to work. Like, this deck largely is going to have a sort of a low curve, so the idea of pumping a bunch of mana into Reconstruction is weird. But at the same time, like, as a late game play in this deck, if you can pay like 6 for this and put 3 creatures into play, that's not terrible. And Gixian Puppeteer can reanimate things with mana value 3 or less. Let's move now to Red-White, which is a fairly straightforward aggro deck. Big surprise, right? And it's got Philagi Vanguard as its signpost. When it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So, this signpost uncommon is pushing you in the direction of going sort of wide, but there aren't actually that many cards in the format that put multiple bodies into play. But there are a few things you can do to make sure you're triggering an effect like this as much as possible. One of them is using Unearth, because, those creatures by their very nature are going to trigger something like this twice. There are a few cards that make multiple bodies. You do have Mass Production, which we've seen. We talked about it triggering artifact stuff, but it triggers creature stuff too. Scrapwork Cohort, same thing, gives you 2 bodies, and it will trigger something like the Signpost uncommon 4 times total. Mishra's Onslaught can be a mass pump spell, which you want if you're going wide, or it can put 2 bodies into play. But there aren't really that many payoffs for actually going wide. So this color pair, and we'll see red-green too, they're both sort of straightforward decks that I don't think actually have that much synergy. They're just like creature-based decks that want you to be playing creatures on most turns, and that's kind of what we have here. But there are a few things you can do to take advantage of extra bodies. You've got the Vanguard, you've got the Paratrooper, who can pump the whole board, and Warlord's Elite, the more extra bodies you have around, the easier it is to cast. And then, of course, Mishra's Onslaught pumps the whole board. There are some rares that go well with this strategy, including Myrel and Platoon Dispenser and In the Trenches, which pumps everything, and Queen Kayla Ben Krug, who, if your mana curve is low enough, you can pay 4 and tap her the turn after you play her and maybe put a bunch of stuff into play and reload your hand. But yeah, that's red-white. Red-green, meanwhile, also a sort of aggressive creature deck, but it's more interested in mid-rangey creature stuff. Like, it's less about playing 1 and 2 drops and more about playing like 3 through 6 drops to take over the game. Arbalest Engineers here embodies that pretty well as a 3-mana 2/2 who gives you a bunch of different potential abilities. You can make Power Stone with it. You know, and this color pair is a little interested in Power Stones, but it's not like all in on them the way blue-green is. You can also put a counter on a creature and against trample and haste that can include itself. This will allow one of your big monsters to get in for damage, or you can ping something. So you've kind of got a few things going on. You're interested in Power Stones because a lot of the stompy things you want to play are actually artifacts. But like I said, you're not all in on them the way a blue-green deck is. So some of the cards that, you know, make sense in this deck, maybe a little more than others, include Giant Cindermaw and Mishra's Juggernaut. You know, just big creatures with trample are things you're interested in. Ironclaw Crusher. You know, this deck, I think, will more often than the blue-green deck just play the prototype versions of these cards because it's more interested in taking over the game around turn 4 and 5 than it is turn 7. So, you know, this is kind of a beastly creature that can come down and attack well and pump your other stuff. Same thing, we've got Boulder Branch Golem. You know, it's a nice thing to help you stabilize the board against a deck that is curving out early. Same thing with the Baloth. So yeah, red-white and red-green both feel sort of like core set versions of these color pairs, which means there's not actually that much synergy that's exclusive or interesting to this set about them. They're just creature decks doing the thing that their color pairs usually do, whereas I think the other 8 color pairs all have sort of unique things going on and a lot more synergy. And it'll be interesting to see whether this format is more about just having a good curve and stuff, the way red, green, and red, white will, or if it's more about synergy that the other 8 decks will have. My guess is both things can probably work, sort of like we saw in Dominaria United, where there was this tension between the domain decks and then just aggro decks, which would be good in any aggro format. So yeah, that does it for this Archetype guide. If you found this video useful, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to see the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. If you want to catch my draft videos and a whole bunch of more Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.